We went out there Friday. I go every spring. It's just a ritual in our family, I suppose. We go to the little town out by Brenham called Chapel Hill. It's settled by my ancestors long ago. My grandmother was a chapel, and that's where my name comes from. It's a place that feels familiar, in part because nothing ever changes in Chapel Hill. I don't think they've built a new building there in the last 50 years. Most of the houses have historical markers on them, and I don't know if there are some of the original settlers living there, but I wouldn't be surprised. I like to go because it feels safe and it feels comforting somehow, which may have been why Jesus was back in Bethany that last week before the Passover, the last week of his life. Like Chapel Hill, it was a pretty small little village. It's over across the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem. There wasn't much to it. And that night, in the village of Bethany, Jesus went to the home of a man known as Simon the leper. Now, right away, that should tell you something, because anytime you are called, others call you by reference to the most dreaded, deadly disease of the day, that probably suggests you are not the most loved individual in town. You've probably spent many years being absolutely shunned by everybody else, lest they get what you've got. And yet, Jesus and his friends not only had come to Simon's house, they had actually sat down to have dinner with him, because St. John tells us the dinner was given that night in honor of Jesus. You say, well, why would Simon the leper honor Jesus? Because Jesus had healed Simon the leper, removed from him all of the social ostracism that comes with that horrible affliction. And Simon was grateful because Jesus had quite literally changed the life of his host completely. But if that wasn't enough, St. John tells us there was another rather famous man in the room that night, Lazarus, the man whom Jesus had raised from the dead after 4 days of being buried in the tomb. You got to know that wherever the not-so-late Mr. Lazarus showed up, all kinds of other people came too, if only just to ask him questions. What was it like to be dead, Lazarus? They probably asked. Did you see Moses or David? Did you see Father Abraham? Are the streets really made of gold in heaven? When Lazarus spoke, I bet people listened. And Lazarus' two sisters were there. You remember them. Mary, the one who had sat at Jesus' feet at a different dinner in her home, while Martha, ever the conscientious one, had slaved away in the kitchen, cooking up a good case of resentment against her sister. Martha, such a good martyr. If there had been a church ladies group, she would have been the president of it, I have no doubt whatsoever. She was an organizer. She knew how to get things done. But sure enough, when the dinner began, Martha was right there serving. But it was Mary, her younger sister, whose actions were the more dramatic. Just shortly after the meal, Mary, Mark doesn't name her, but St. John does in his account of this incident. Mary came into the room, and while Jesus was reclining at the table with Simon the leper and with Lazarus and with the disciples, she broke open a jar which she had carried in with her. It was an alabaster flask of costly perfume. And as the sweet fragrance began to fill the room, she quietly and devotedly began to anoint the head and the feet of the one whom she had come to love. Mary, you see, had been there on the day when Jesus went to the tomb of her brother and called him out of the tomb back to life. from that moment on, I suspect Mary's love for Jesus took on a whole new dimension, an entirely new passion. She understood that Jesus was exactly who he had said he was. I am the resurrection. I am the life. But oddly enough, some of those who were there that night in the home of Simon, the former leper, had a very different response. They said to themselves indignantly, we might know, literally with much grief, why has this perfume been wasted? It's a pretty strong word the gospel uses. Wasted. Apoleia. That's a term that implies the destruction that consists of eternal misery in hell. Wasted. Apoleia. What they wanted to know was, what in the hell is Mary doing? That little bottle of perfume could have been fetched a year's worth of wages. Now, that's comparatively more than Chanel number 5, which goes for $340 for a 30 milliliter bottle. If you want the limited edition of the Grand et Stamped Chanel number 5, it goes for $30,000 a bottle. Thank goodness they never made Chanel number 6, huh? And then those disgruntled dinner companions added, that money could have been given to the poor. They rebuked Mary strongly, snorting, it suggests, with anger. Until Jesus, in no uncertain terms, spoke up. And he said, shut up. Now, it doesn't say he said shut up, but I bet he did. Leave her alone. She's done a beautiful thing. Wherever the gospel's preached, what she has done will be told in memory of her. And so it has been. So we do today. For the encounter of Mary with Jesus there in the home of Simon, the former leper, has some enduring lessons which we might remember. Mary showed us, for instance, that in the eternal order of things, praise must always take priority over program. See, Judas was right. The nard of the perfume was costly. Probably a family heirloom that had been handed down from generation to generation. Makes me wonder what Martha thought of it. It could have been sold in order to provide for the needs for the poor, which were no doubt very real and compellingly grim. Then that would have made a whole lot more sense. It would have made a lot of people happy. It would have fed some hungry children. It would have clothed some people. It would have helped break the cycle of poverty. It would help people discover how to provide for themselves. Who wouldn't be in favor of that? You could run for president on that platform. Except for one thing. Mary understood, no matter how important serving, helping other people is, there is something even more important, and that is responding to Jesus personally and loving him in whatever way, whenever we can. I suspect Mary was still remembering that night what Jesus had said long before at that other dinner party at her house, when her sister Martha had gotten so angry with her for not helping that he had said, there's only one thing that is ultimately needful in any of our lives, that is to sit at the feet of the Master until we finally begin to understand what he's saying to us. Ultimately, our praise of him has to take priority over everything else, even the things we seek to do for him. Doesn't mean we don't do them, of course. Some have said Jesus was commending an attitude of benign neglect toward the poor. Nothing could be further from the truth. The poor you will have with you always. You can help them anytime you want to, he said. Thus help them, indeed, he expects you and me to do. Just as he expects us to be about the business of evangelizing others, he expects us to be about teaching others, he expects us to be spreading his gospel, he expects us to stand for social justice, he expects us to educate minds and to heal bodies and do all of the things that the Church of Jesus Christ has been brought into being to do. But in the midst of all of that busyness, let us never forget that we do it all because we love the Lord. And we love the Lord because he first loved us. And unless and until we've met the Master in unfeigned worship, then all of our good deeds may be helpful, but let me tell you what Jesus calls them. Let me tell you what the Bible calls them. Filthy rags. Worthless bundles. Praise takes priority over program. But secondly, it's not just that. It's also the case that our motives matter, not just what we do, but why we do it. See, what Judas wanted to do sounded good, but his motives were all wrong. He didn't really care about the poor. The evidence, in fact, is that like so many others have done throughout history, Judas only wanted to use the poor as a rallying point for his more personal revolutionary goals. And the other disciples may have chimed in because, well, if there's one thing that is incurably contagious, it is the spirit of criticism. You begin to harp and carp on something and stay with it, and before long, somebody else will join your pessimistic chorus. It's guaranteed. But if you're singing in that choir this morning, then look out. Even if what you're saying is correct, if your motive for saying it isn't so true, the Lord will see right through you every time. He'll call your deception for what it is. Leave her alone, Jesus said. Even if Mary did that night, even if what she did seemed not to be the most financially responsible decision, Jesus saw her motives. He recognized they were the true ones. He saw they were very similar to those of another woman who had impressed him earlier, a widow who had come into the temple treasury with just 2 small coins in her hand. 100% of what she had. Isn't it curious? The world despised the widow's gift as too small, criticized Mary's anointing as too much, too wasteful, too exorbitant, too exhibitionist, too unrealistic. But Mary's motives were the right one. What she came to do that day, simply to let Jesus know how deeply he loved him. You suppose Jesus has a clue about how deeply you and I love him? You suppose he's sensed that we really do love him more than anything else? Of course, for him to sense that, we'd have to feel that, wouldn't we? That'd have to be in us first. Brings us to note as well, the example of Mary here teaches us anything. It teaches us about the power of pure love. That was at the root of her action. Love, what we might even call reckless love. Love like the Good Samaritan had for the Israelite who had been beaten and left on the side of the road. Love that cost him something, love that threatened him, love that required something of him. Love that wasn't very wise, reckless love. And I tell you, that's the kind of love that thrills Jesus the most. Others may think you're a bit of a fanatic if you dare to demonstrate that kind of love. I know a lot of folks would rather be called anything else than to be called a fanatic. But breaking the jar of perfume, That was pretty fanatical, wasn't it? I mean, it wasn't like Mary came in and just dabbed a little oil of Olay on the master's toes. Took a whole flask of incredibly expensive perfume, and she smashed it open in order to pour it on his feet and on his head. That's pretty fanatical. I wonder if the world needs more fanatics today. Not religious bigots, thinking, feeling, loving Christians who are willing to give God the very best in their life, not just the leftovers. Dedicated, concentrated disciples whose commitments to Christ hold up on the good days and on the bad, when the weather is great and when it's lousy, when the money is there and when it's not, when the kids are well and when they're sniffling again, when we feel like worshiping and when we don't. When we unleash the power of loving God, anything and everything can happen. When we're willing to break out those alabaster treasures in our lives and lay them at the feet of the Master, not out of guilt, not out of manipulation, not out of anything else, but just pure love, genuine miracles will break out all around us. The power of pure love not only bless God and bring him joy, it will spill out and bless others as well. Read some time ago of a mother of 3 who went back to complete her college degree. The last class she had to take was in sociology, and for the final project of the term, the class was given an assignment: go out and smile at 3 people and document their reactions. Being a friendly person, she thought, well, this would be easy. Soon after she was assigned the project, she and her husband and their youngest son went to McDonald's one cold winter's day. And while they were standing in line, all of a sudden, everyone around them began to sort of back away. She turned to see why they'd moved, and as she did so, she began to smell that kind of dirty body smell. Standing behind her were 2 poor homeless men. She looked down and saw the short gentleman closest to her. He was smiling. His beautiful sky blue eyes were full of God's light as he searched for acceptance. He said good day as he counted the few coins he had he was clutching. The second man fumbled with his hands as he stood behind his friend. Then the woman began to realize the second man was mentally deficient, and the blue-eyed gentleman was his salvation. She held back her tears as she stood there with them and listened as they ordered coffee, because she quickly realized that was all they could afford to pay for in order to be able to sit in that restaurant out of the cold. And then she felt this compulsion so great, she almost reached out and embraced that little man with the blue eyes, and everybody in the restaurant was watching her. She smiled. She asked the young lady behind the counter to give her 2 more breakfast meals on a separate tray. She then walked around the corner of the table where the men had chosen as their resting spot. She put the tray on the table. She laid her hand on the blue-eyed gentleman's cold hand. He looked up at her with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Thank you." She leaned over and began to pat his hand. She said, "I did not do this for you. God is here working through me to give you hope." The woman started to cry as she walked away to join her husband and son. When she sat down, her husband smiled and he said, "That is why God gave you to me, to give me hope." That day, the woman said she saw the pure light of God's sweet love. She went back to college on the last evening of class, and with this story in hand, she turned in her project. I have a feeling that on the last night she spent as a college student, she had actually graduated, having learned a far more important lesson, the biggest lesson any of us can ever learn, which is the power of unconditional acceptance, the power of pure love. My grandmother had that love. When my older brother got married, he went to pick up his suit, and it was not ready and it was not right. And they began to make excuses at Cox's department store in Waco. And my grandmother, who stood about, 2'4" or something, I don't know, she was very short. She went up to the gentleman that was the manager of the store, stood about 7'10", and she just poked him as high as she could get. She said, "I want you to know that I know that you done my grandson dirty." Gave him the worst stare I've ever seen and turned and walked away. Now you could say she wasn't showing love to that store manager, but she was sure showing love to my older brother. It was clear. He could do nothing wrong. She loved him as she loved me. If you take nothing else from this worship service, I hope you'll understand the power of reckless love can set you free this morning. If you're willing to love Jesus and love others like he has loved you, you will become one of the most powerful people on this earth, bar none other. That moment in the house of a man known as Simon the leper, Mary's encounter with the Christ changed her life forever as well, even if she didn't know the full implications of what she was doing. Listen again to what the Lord had to say about her. She did what she could, a beautiful thing. And I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel story is told throughout the world, what she has done will also be told. Maybe so for you and me. So I invite you this morning, love Jesus just a little bit more. Worship a little more enthusiastically. Show signs of life in the pews. Sing the hymns a little louder. Say amen like you mean it. Interrupt the sermon if you have to. It's perfectly fine. And then come to Jesus and bring your treasures to his feet, broken and poured out. That's how you do a beautiful thing for him. And what you have done one day will also be told, if only to that magnificent audience of one. Amen.